It's that time again. Another episode of Critical History. Last time out, we discussed roughly the first 20 years of the Italian Wars, where the French invaded Italy all the way to Napoli, before being chased out and deciding to ally with Aragon and Castile in an attempt to rule it jointly. This was followed by about a decade of shifting alliances between Venice, the Papal States, the French, and the Spanish Habsburgs. At the end of the last video, I mentioned that we haven't yet touched on the Battle of Pavia, the development of new military tactics in the form of tercios and landknechts, or the reign of Charles V. It's actually a very interesting time, as Leonardo da Vinci, Henry VIII, Michelangelo, the great explorers, Francis I of France, Martin Luther, and Charles V all made their mark at this time. In the course of my research, I came across something interesting, where the credit for the French success in their initial invasion of southern Italy was given to their use of cannon and artillery. In particular, the ability of their cannons to reduce castle walls to rubble. In the first video, I was under the impression that it was more a case of overwhelming force causing the Italians to surrender, but if it is true that this was due to artillery, that is a very interesting side note. Why? Because it's widely acknowledged that at this time, after the siege of Constantinople in 1453, it was the Ottomans and their allies that were at the forefront of gunpowder weaponry, although apparently that's a contentious statement. It's known that the largest cannon used in the siege of 1453 was designed by an engineer by the name of Urban. Apparently Urban tried to sell his cannon not only to the Sultan, but also to the Byzantine Emperor. Good thinking. Urban is said to have been either Hungarian, Wallachian, Dacian, or to have possibly had German ancestry. He was from Brasov in modern-day Romania. Interestingly enough, Brasov is in the diocese of Cumania, and it is less than 300 miles from Moldova and Ukraine. The overarching idea here is that it is possible that the Habsburgs, Muscovy, and the Ottomans were in a confederation or loose alliance, the terms and details of which were extremely fluid, ultimately resulting in the three turning on each other. Apparently there is a grand strategy game by the name of Europa Universalis, and players are none too pleased when the Ottomans and Muscovy ally with each other, which isn't proof of a historical alliance, but it is an indication that it would have been a very powerful alliance at the time. Also worth mentioning is the similarity between the Habsburg coat of arms and the Russian coat of arms. I'm sure there's a good explanation for why that's the case. One of my favorite parts of studying history is to see how history like this gets explained away. So let me take my best guess. If I was a 17th century Jesuit tasked with rewriting history, possibly the Russians lacked imagination and simply copied the Habsburg coat of arms? So where were we? Ah yes, Ottoman super cannons. Now I know what you're going to say. There were other bombards built in the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, that is true. Some of them were of similar size as the Ottoman artillery. Were they the same quality and effectiveness? That is a different question, and the story of the Western bombards seems to always be the same: extremely difficult to transport and only used a handful of times. Either way, it seems to me the French may have learned some of their expertise either from the Holy Roman Empire or from the Ottomans. Let me digress once more. The word artillery is an interesting one, supposedly of French and Latin roots. Not particularly convincing though, in my opinion. Leaning on the work of Anatoly Fomenko once more, I swear it's going to take the rest of us 30 years to catch up to him, he wondered if the word artillery wasn't related to the hordes and military orders. Arta, Orda, Horda. Not convinced? Ever heard of ordnance? Want another example? Pistol. Pistol is another word that is supposed to have a French origin, but they admit pistola, meaning whistle or pipe, was used in Bohemia, modern-day Czechia, almost 100 years before the Italian Wars. For me, though, the etymology of pistol is a good example of even a case where the origin is pretty clear, others, in this case the French, try to take credit for it. Alright, so back to the Italian Wars. Rather than try to summarize the period between roughly 1518 and 1560, I want to take a minute to look at the military technology, formations, and tactics of the time. The Tercios. Before the Tercios, warfare in Europe was dominated by heavy cavalry. Knights. This then led to the development of castles, as a mounted knight is utterly ineffective against a fortification. And although the British were able to make good use of longbows to neutralize heavy cavalry, such as at Crécy, this required not just the right equipment, but also the right weather conditions and the right environment. In this case, swampy ground for cavalry to get bogged down in. On an open plain, in the rain, for example, knights would still have absolutely massacred the longbowmen. It's also well known that archers took notoriously long to become proficient, whereas a few hundred years later, a musketman could be trained in just a few weeks. Which brings us back to the Tercios. Tercios were mixed units made up of pikemen, swordsmen, and musketmen. Some of the swordsmen wielded gigantic Zweihanders, two-handed swords. Most don't realize, but these swords were actually used against the enemy's pikes. The pikemen were obviously there to provide defense for the musketmen from a cavalry charge. This is why tercios commonly formed squares, so that there were pikemen in every direction and the formation could not be outflanked. The musketmen, meanwhile, were tasked with slowly but steadily engaging the enemy in a battle of attrition. The remainder of the heavy lifting would be done by the cannon, and if the enemy retreated or appeared vulnerable, the cavalry would be called upon. Now we know from my video on the 30 Years' War that the Spanish square was ultimately defeated by lines of musketmen. But at the time of the Italian Wars, that military revolution was still almost a century away. Tercio squares were staggered so that they would not fire upon one another if the enemy tried to advance in between them. The name tercio means a third, and it comes from the idea that an army had to be made up of 3 tercios, of up to about 3,000 men each, fighting together. There were also usually many more pikemen and musketmen than swordsmen. Swordsmen were only about 20%, maybe less, of the formation, and pikemen slightly outnumbered the musketmen. The other theory of the name tercio is that it comes from the makeup of the 3 different types of soldier. Apparently that was true of the tercios in the beginning, but over time the amount of swordsmen greatly decreased. At this time, mercenaries were in high demand, and the Germans and Swiss were basically in competition with each other for bragging rights, which would then result in higher demand for their services and, of course, higher pay. If you think about the Vatican, even today is guarded by Swiss guards. The flamboyant uniforms that the mercenaries of the time were known for arose from the fact that they were pieced together from whatever they could get their hands on. Imagine mercs fighting over a piece of clothing. What's going to happen? It's going to be cut into 4 pieces and split between 4 men. Now that we've discussed the tercios, let's talk about their greatest success, the Battle of Pavia in 1525. After many years of fighting, the French had won control of Lombardy and the Duchy of Milan. But in 1522, they once again lost it. On the one side stood the Habsburg imperial army of Charles V. On the other, the army of Francis I, of France naturally. Both sides were fairly evenly matched, with almost 20,000 soldiers each, although the French seem to have had more cannon and cavalry. The Pope at this time was not Papa Julio or a Borgia, but rather a Medici. Giulio de' Medici, aka Pope Clement VII. The Medici at this time were not only popes and bankers, but also mercenary captains. Anyway, it seems the Pope and Francis came to a secret agreement. With the Medicis, though, you were never so much an ally as you were useful. So in return for the Pope not assisting Charles V, Francis pledged to support him in his conquest of Napoli. Before sending assistance to the Pope, Francis's army was even larger, and they succeeded in capturing Milan, where the imperial troops retreated rather than fight in a futile effort to defend it. Francis kept pursuing them, though, because he knew that without defeating the imperial army, he had accomplished nothing. The Medici mercenary captain, Giovanni, was injured in the skirmishes days before the major battle, and he had to withdraw, taking his troops with him. A convenient bit of self-preservation, as it turned out. So the French army was in a fortified position, but under siege from the imperial army. The imperial army was running out of supplies, so they decided to attack. But they had to conceal their movements, so they set their tents on fire, which was customarily done when the army was retreating. At the same time, they started an artillery bombardment. At 5 a.m., they had created a breach, and 3,000 musketmen and additional light cavalry entered. Cavalry from both sides engaged with each other, but it seems no one had spotted the musketmen, probably because 5 a.m. in February is as dark as night. Oh, good Lord. 5 a.m. in February? Dark as night. By 6:30, Swiss pike were arriving to assist the French cavalry, but 6,000 imperial mercenaries had also arrived. At 7:40, the French realized the extent of the Spanish attacks, as their artillery seemed to finally spot the musketmen that had breached the gap hours earlier. Francis launched a full-scale cavalry charge, which forced the Spanish cavalry to retreat. But the French were not fighting as a cohesive whole, and they were finding themselves outnumbered locally. Soon Francis's cavalry was surrounded by Tercios, and they were slowly being picked off. Francis was captured, his rear guard never entered the battle, and those that had been manning the siege lines were vastly outnumbered, and by the time they realized what was occurring, they fled and were cut down in the process. Another interesting aspect is that German mercenaries were completely ruthless to the mercenaries fighting for Francis, and massacred them almost to a man. The end to a long-standing rivalry between groups of men that had probably been on opposing sides a dozen times over the previous years. As if being captured wasn't bad enough for Francis, he found out that the troops he had sent to Napoli had largely deserted. The outcome of the battle was the Treaty of Madrid, in which Francis surrendered his claims to Italy, Flanders, and Burgundy, as well as sending 2 of his sons to Madrid to be kept hostage. He was released in March the following year, but claimed the treaty was signed under duress and refused to comply with its terms. It had other impacts too, though. Because of the debts Charles V incurred, he decided not to marry the daughter of the King of England, Henry VIII, but instead married a Portuguese princess, who would provide a larger dowry. Not only that, but the growing power of Charles helped secure the Franco-Ottoman alliance between the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and Francis. The Pope and Henry VIII were also wary of the growing power of the empire. There seems to be a very important historical lesson here. The more powerful a nation or an empire becomes, the more your enemies will put aside their differences to fight against you. So although the Pope, the Ottoman Sultan, and the French and English kings were not powerful enough to defeat the Habsburgs and their empire, they could hinder its growth, undermine its legitimacy, and subvert it. The following century is generally referred to as the Spanish Golden Age, while the efforts to tarnish its legacy are known as the Black Legend. What's a black legend, you say? Well, for once, I actually agree with how Wikipedia puts it. A black legend is a historiographical phenomenon in which a sustained trend in historical writing of biased reporting and introduction of fabricated, exaggerated, or decontextualized facts is directed against particular persons, nations, or institutions, with the intention of creating a distorted and uniquely inhuman image of them, while hiding their positive contributions to history. I wonder if there are any black legends being spread today. That about does it for this episode. Remember to hit the like, smash the subscribe, drop a comment, check out my book, tune in next time, and until then, you know what to do. Stay critical. Roll the credits.